Shadows of justice dust swirled like restless spirits around Eli Carter's boots as he rode into Dusty Gulch. The town, a scattering of ramshackle buildings baking under the merciless sun, felt like a ghost town in broad daylight. Something was rotten in Dusty Gulch, worse than a week-old carcass in July. Eli, a man whose mind was as sharp as his Colt .45, felt it in his bones. He wasn't just a gunslinger, he was a philosopher with a pistol, a rare breed in the Wild West. He dismounted in front of the saloon, its swinging doors creaking a mournful tune in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation. A lone piano player tinkled out a sad melody, each note a tear falling on the dusty floor. Eli's gaze swept across the room, taking in the hardened faces, the slumped shoulders, the fear that hung heavy in the air like a storm cloud. He bellied up to the bar, ordering a whiskey. Whiskey for a weary traveler, he drawled to the barkeep, a man whose eyes looked like he'd seen too much sun and not enough kindness. Heard tell this town's seen better days. The barkeep, a fella named Jebediah, wiped down the bar with a rag that looked like it had seen better centuries. Better days? Mister, this town's been 6 feet under for a month now, just waiting for someone to throw the dirt on top. Eli's eyes narrowed. Missing folks, you say? Jebediah nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing like a cork in a whirlpool. Sheriff Thompson, he says they just up and left. But folks don't just vanish into thin air, especially not when they got families. Eli felt a knot tightening in his gut. He'd seen enough of the world to know when something was wrong. He was a man haunted by his past, a past he tried to bury deep with whiskey and philosophy. But Dusty Gulch was stirring something within him, a fire he thought had long died. He spent the next few days asking questions, poking around like a badger in a burrow. He discovered that Sheriff Thompson, a man with a smile as slick as a greased pig, ruled the town with an iron fist. Rumors whispered of shady deals, of land grabs, of folks disappearing in the dead of night. The townsfolk were caught between a rock and a hard place, fear kept them silent. One evening, Eli found himself in the local graveyard, the wind whispering secrets through the tombstones. He stumbled upon a freshly dug grave, the dirt still loose. He knelt down, his heart pounding like a drum. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the missing citizens hadn't just left. They'd been silenced. The revelation ignited a fire in Eli. He was tired of running from his past, tired of standing by while injustice prevailed. He was going to fight, even if it meant facing down a corrupt sheriff and his gang of cutthroats. The climax arrived like a desert storm, sudden and violent. Eli faced Thompson and his men in the dusty street, the midday sun glinting off his gun. The townsfolk watched from their windows, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. Eli wasn't just fighting for Dusty Gulch, he was fighting for his own soul. The gunfight was a whirlwind of smoke and gunfire. Eli moved like a phantom, his gun a blur. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of justice. When the dust settled, Thompson lay dead in the street, his reign of terror finally over. Eli stood there, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of blood orange and purple. He had faced his demons and emerged victorious. Dusty Gulch was free, but Eli knew his journey wasn't over. There were other towns, other shadows lurking in the vast expanse of the West. He was a wanderer, a seeker of justice, a shadow himself, moving in the shadows to bring light to the darkness. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. Eli Carter, his silhouette stark against the dying light, stood amidst the dust and echoes of the recent gunfight. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and the weight of what had transpired, hung heavy over Dusty Gulch. He holstered his Colt, the cool steel a familiar comfort in his hand. The townsfolk, emerging tentatively from their homes, looked at him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Jebediah, his eyes no longer clouded with fear, clapped Eli on the shoulder. "You done right by us, Eli," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "You brought the light back to Dusty Gulch." Eli offered a wry smile. "Light's a fickle thing, Jebediah. It flickers, fades. Takes constant tending." He knew the darkness wasn't banished forever. It just shifted, regrouped, waiting for its chance to creep back in. He'd seen it too many times. He spent a few more days in Dusty Gulch, helping the town get back on its feet. He listened to their stories, their hopes, their fears. He was no longer just a gunslinger passing through. He was a part of their story, a chapter, however brief, in their struggle for survival. He helped them elect a new sheriff, a man with honest eyes and a steady hand. He offered advice, shared what little wisdom he'd gleaned from his travels. But he knew he couldn't stay. The road called to him, a siren song of dust and destiny. One crisp morning, with the sun just peeking over the horizon, Eli saddled his horse, a sturdy Palomino named Reason. He looked back at Dusty Gulch, the town now bathed in the golden light of dawn. It was a small victory, a flicker of light in the vast darkness of the west. But victories, however small, were worth fighting for. As he rode out of town, he felt a familiar tug, a sense of unease. He wasn't being followed, not exactly. It was more of a feeling, a whisper on the wind, a shadow lurking just beyond his peripheral vision. He knew it was the past, the demons he thought he buried. They were always there, lurking, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. He spurred Reason into a gallop, the wind whipping through his hair. He rode for days, crossing vast stretches of desert, scaling rocky mountains, fording rushing rivers. He found himself in a small, forgotten town called Salvation. It was a town much like Dusty Gulch, plagued by hardship and fear. The local rancher, a gruff but honest man named Caleb, told him about the troubles they were facing. A land baron, a ruthless man named Silas Thorne, was trying to force them off their land, using intimidation and violence. Eli listened, his jaw tight. He'd heard this story before, seen this play out countless times. The strong preying on the weak, the greedy stealing what wasn't theirs. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't turn a blind eye. He was a shadow, a whisper of justice in a world that desperately needed it. He found Thorne in his opulent ranch house, a sprawling mansion that seemed out of place in the desolate landscape. Thorne, a man with a face as hard as granite and eyes as cold as a winter storm, greeted him with a sneer. "You're the one they call Carter," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Heard you're some kind of philosopher gunslinger. Think you can stop me?" Eli's eyes met Thorne's. "I'm just a man trying to do what's right," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I knew, Thorne, you're on the wrong side of the line." Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The wrong side? There are no sides out here, Carter. Just the strong and the weak. And I'm the strongest." "We'll see about that," Eli said, his hand hovering over the butt of his gun. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Thorne had hired guns of his own, men as ruthless as their master. But Eli wasn't afraid. He had faced down worse odds before. He was a shadow, a force of nature, a whisper of justice in a world that often forgot what it meant. And he wouldn't rest until justice was served. Thorne's laughter echoed through the grand hall, bouncing off the polished wood and expensive furnishings. "You think you can stand against me, Carter? A lone wolf against a pack?" He gestured towards the shadows flanking him, where his hired guns lurked, their faces hard and unforgiving. They looked like they'd been weaned on gunpowder and whiskey, their eyes devoid of any hint of compassion. Eli's gaze swept over them, his expression unwavering. "A pack can be broken," he said, his voice low and steady. "And a lone wolf can be more dangerous than you think." He wasn't just talking about the men in front of him. He was talking about the darkness that lurked in every man's heart, the greed and the lust for power that could corrupt even the best of intentions. He knew, because he had wrestled with those demons himself. The air crackled with tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. Thorne's smile faded, replaced by a snarl. "You're a fool, Carter," he hissed. "You've ridden into a trap." "Maybe," Eli replied, his hand still hovering near his gun. "But traps can be sprung." Before Thorne could react, Eli moved. He was faster than a striking rattlesnake, his hand a blur as he drew his Colt. The first shot rang out, shattering the silence, hitting one of Thorne's men square in the chest. The man crumpled to the floor like a sack of potatoes. The fight had begun. The room erupted in chaos. Gunfire flashed, echoing through the hall. Eli moved with a grace that belied his rugged exterior, dodging bullets, weaving through the chaos like a phantom. He was a whirlwind of motion, a dance of death. His gun barked, spitting lead, each shot finding its mark. He wasn't just shooting, he was thinking, calculating, anticipating his opponent's moves. He was a chess player in a gunfight, every move planned, every shot precise. Thorne watched in disbelief as his men fell around him. He'd underestimated Carter. He'd thought him just another gunslinger, another drifter looking for trouble. He was wrong. Carter was something else entirely. He was a force of nature, a whisper of justice, a shadow moving in the darkness. As the last of Thorne's men fell, Thorne himself made a desperate grab for a rifle leaning against the wall. Eli was on him in an instant, disarming him with a swift kick. Thorne stumbled back, his face contorted with rage and fear. "It's over, Thorne," Eli said, his voice calm but firm. "Your reign of terror is done." Thorne looked at the bodies of his men, then back at Eli, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. "You can't kill me," he stammered. "I'm a powerful man. I have influence." Eli's eyes hardened. "Power doesn't make you above the law, Thorne. It makes you more accountable." He holstered his gun, then turned to the ranch hands who had been watching the fight from the shadows, their faces etched with fear and hope. "Take him to the authorities," he said, gesturing towards Thorne. "Let justice take its course." He knew that justice was often slow and imperfect, but it was all they had. It was a flicker of light in the darkness, and it was worth fighting for. He spent a few more days in Salvation, helping the townspeople rebuild their lives. He listened to their stories, their hopes, their dreams. He was a part of their story now, a chapter in their fight for survival. As he rode out of Salvation, he looked back at the town, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. It was another small victory, another flicker of light in the vast darkness of the west. But Eli knew his journey wasn't over. There were other towns, other shadows lurking in the vast expanse of the west. He was a wanderer, a seeker of justice, a shadow himself, moving in the shadows to bring light to the darkness. The setting sun painted the sky in a vibrant tapestry of orange, purple, and gold as Eli Carter rode away from Salvation. The dust swirled behind him like the ghosts of the recent conflict, a reminder of the violence he'd witnessed, the lives he'd touched. He glanced back at the town, the flickering lights a testament to the resilience of its people. He knew they'd rebuild, they'd endure. They had the spark of hope rekindled within them, and that was more powerful than any land baron or hired gun. But Eli couldn't linger. The road called to him, a relentless whisper in the wind. He was a wanderer, a shadow drifting across the landscape, drawn to the places where darkness held sway. He knew there were other towns like Salvation, other people suffering under the yoke of injustice. He was a beacon, however faint, in a world that often seemed lost in the shadows. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Eli traversed vast stretches of wilderness, his journey a constant cycle of dusty trails, lonely campfires, and fleeting encounters. He saw the beauty of the West, the majestic mountains, the endless plains, the vibrant sunsets that painted the sky with breathtaking colors. But he also saw the ugliness, the greed, the violence, the broken dreams that littered the landscape like discarded whiskey bottles. He rode into a town called Redemption, a name that seemed almost ironic given its current state. The town was gripped by fear, its inhabitants terrorized by a gang of outlaws led by a notorious gunslinger named Cutter's Clay. Clay was a legend in the West, a man whispered about in hushed tones around campfires. He was fast, ruthless, and seemingly untouchable. Eli knew he couldn't ignore the plight of Redemption. He'd heard stories of Clay's cruelty, his disregard for human life. He was a cancer on the land, and Eli knew he had to be excised. He rode into Redemption with a quiet determination. He didn't swagger, didn't boast. He simply walked into the saloon, his presence a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Clay and his gang were there, holding court, their laughter loud and obnoxious. They turned to face Eli, their eyes narrowed, their hands hovering near their guns. Clay, a tall, lean man with a scar that ran across his cheek like a jagged lightning bolt, stepped forward. "You Carter," he sneered. "Heard tell you're some kind of philosopher gunslinger. You here to save us, preacher?" Eli's gaze met Clay's. "I'm here to bring justice," he replied, his voice calm but firm. Clay laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Justice? Out here, there's only the quick and the dead." "Then you're already dead," Eli said, his hand moving with lightning speed. His colt barked, the sound echoing through the saloon. Clay staggered back, a look of surprise on his face. He clutched at his chest, then crumpled to the floor. The room erupted in chaos. Clay's gang drew their guns, but Eli was faster. He moved like a whirlwind, his gun spitting lead, each shot finding its mark. The fight was over quickly, brutally. When the dust settled, Clay's gang lay dead or wounded on the floor. Eli stood there, his gun still smoking, his face impassive. He had faced down another demon, brought light to another dark corner of the West. He knew there would be others, other towns, other shadows. His journey was far from over. He looked around the saloon, at the faces of the townsfolk, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. He offered a small, weary smile. "Redemption," he said softly. Maybe the name fits after all. He knew he couldn't stay. The road was calling him, whispering his name in the wind. He was a shadow, a whisper of justice, a force of nature, moving across the vast landscape, bringing light to the darkness, one town at a time. His journey was a never-ending one, a constant battle against the shadows. But he wouldn't have it any other way. It was his purpose, his destiny. He was Eli Carter, the philosopher gunslinger, and he would keep riding until his last breath. Join the adventure with the Western Echoes, Cowboy Tales Unleashed. If you're loving our cowboy stories and captivating tales, don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button to stay updated on all our future posts. Saddle up and ride along with us.